let's talk about the co-main event. All right. We talked about the main. We all want to see the rematch. Co-main event, just as notable. Charles Oliveira defeats Tony Ferguson. You could have made a case that every round was a 10-8. You could also make a case you add 10 seconds to the first round. Tony Ferguson either taps or his arm snaps. I don't know how he survived that. But in the end, Oliveira extends his winning streak to 8. Now Ferguson loses 2 in a row. He doesn't get to tie the Anderson Silva record, Oliveira, of 8 straight finishes. But hey, who cares? He gets a big win over Tony Ferguson. And so there's 2 questions I would ask you, and you could pick whichever way you want to go. Was the story from that fight Oliveira emerging as a real player, maybe a guy who we should have been talking about a few months ago, 155? Or was the story coming out of that fight the decline of Tony Ferguson?
You know, it's like, so yes, like I just spoke about, right? Davison and Brandon, the challenger becomes the story. In this one, it closed, you know, the odds weren't very bad. And what we have seen of Tony Ferguson was that he has been so competitive for so long. But the reality was there were a lot of changes with Tony Ferguson, right? The corner looked different. Just the actions. A lot of things looked different about Tony Ferguson last week. And, you know, in hindsight, it's easy to say he didn't seem like the same guy and all this other stuff. We had a very interesting fighter call with him on Thursday. He freaked out and he was yelling at me. We argued a little bit, but ultimately
he yelled at you?
Yeah, we had some back. We have disagreements in terms of coaching philosophy, but ultimately Tony and I were amicable as we parted ways because he's a great guy. But the story is Charles Oliveira. And when you look at Charles Oliveira and you think about how when Khabib said he was done, we talked about everybody else and he was just an afterthought. He's no afterthought anymore. In reality is he should be in there. He should be in a title fight because I believe the guy is that good and he dominated Tony Ferguson and it was not competitive. And can I say something? Even when Tony was winning all those fights, the 12-fight win streak, I feel if you'd have ran into Charles Oliveira with that skill set, Charles would have beat him back then. I don't know if it's about Tony being worse or Tony declining. I think Charles Oliveira is just that good. And I think he's finally found the right weight class. And the dude has complete skills. And it's madness. But then, like, when I think about last week's show, right, we talked about a crossroads for Tony Ferguson, right? And I saw you got blasted. Why would they say the crossroads?
Right.
Dude, it was a crossroads fight. And now look at where his career seems to be heading, right?
Right. No, it's a crazy thing because you have 2 really interesting stories to come out of it. Number one, Charles, as you just spoke about, 27th UFC fight. This guy's been in the UFC since 2010, right? And like I said, he was on that winning streak. For the longest time, he was having trouble making weight at 145. He would go up to 155 and say, I want to go back down. And everyone's like, why you want to go back down? You're good at 155. You're really good at 155. You know, the record for most fights before getting a UFC title fight is 25, Michael Bisping. So if he gets one, he'll break that record. And I feel like he's really close. By the way, most submissions in UFC history, 14. This guy is really good. And so I'm wondering, like, does he get the winner of McGregor-Poirier? Because if we assume Gaethje and Chandler are going to fight, that's cool. But, like, he should be fighting a guy like that. Not all due respect to RDA and stuff. Like, I think Oliveira's past those guys at this point. So I'm really curious to see.
Bro, what's up? Like, he just beat the perennial number 1 guy in the weight class. I mean, Tony Ferguson has been the number 1 ranked fighter at lightweight. You know, he hasn't been the champ, but since 2014, 15, he's been like number 1 since then. And now Charles Oliveira beat him, but he not only beat him, bro, he dominated Tony. I mean,
it was never
close.
There
was never a thought where you thought Tony Ferguson was going to win this fight. He was beating him in the stand-up. He was dominating him on the ground. When was the last time we saw somebody just grab Ferguson and throw him on the ground and beat him up like that? I mean, Kevin Lee mounted him, but that was a bit of a moment. And then once that moment was over, Tony was competitive again. This dude just demolished him.
And so the harsh reality for Tony is this has been coming. This has been brewing for some times. This didn't start with Justin Gaethje. Tony takes a lot of damage.
Yeah.
Tony's a different kind of cat, right? He doesn't have a structured team. He doesn't have a head coach. He just changed everything. He trains a little differently. He's approaching 37. Like, you shouldn't be shocked. 12 fights in a row is a long stretch to go undefeated. But those fights, these aren't Khabib 12 fights in a row. These are fights where he was getting bloodied, getting beaten, taking damage. Yeah. You know, like
a lot of people.
Remember Lando Venata almost beat him. And I'm not trying to do some revisionist history here. All I'm saying is this should have come as a shock. It has nothing to do with him cutting weight twice in 3 weeks, as some people like to say. It has something to do with at some point you're going to start fighting guys like Gaethje, like Charles Oliveira, and the skills will deteriorate. But it's a sad story because he never got to fight for the undisputed gold. And I don't know if that time is going to happen. Now, could they give it to him? Could he win one fight and they give it to him based on a lifetime achievement? Sure, the sport is different.
It doesn't happen.
But not at 155 because there's so many guys ahead of him now. And that's why I said it was a crossroads fight, right? Because now you have Oliveira who just went this way, and unfortunately Tony Ferguson just went the other way.
Well, where does Tony Ferguson even go now? And that's the thing, right? So like people talk about some of these older fighters like JDS and those guys, and they're constantly put in there with the best fighters. But he's Tony Ferguson. You cannot say now Tony Ferguson goes and fights just some random dude. He'll end up fighting a very tough guy again, a Paul Felder, a Dan Hooker. He'll end up in there with another high-level guy that might get him again. And it's like, it's very difficult to watch. But the reality is, dude took a lot of damage for a long time. And his toughness is what carried him. And honestly, his toughness also allowed him to even stay in the fight on Saturday because most guys would have tapped. And I probably would have told Tony to tap if I was out there. I couldn't even watch it, Ariel. I actually put my head to the ground. Like, I can't watch because I figured he would allow him to break his arm before he would ever tap because he's just that tough.
He's so tough. By the way, can I just say something? I love the Felder idea for both.
Yeah, I mean,
Felder Ferguson to me feels like a very fair fight. They're both coming off losses, tough as nails, fan favorites, sort of at the same spot right now. Tony might be going down a little bit, but hey, I love that fight. That makes a lot of sense to me.
It's a great fight, great matchup, and it would be fun. But ultimately, let's talk about Tony because again, going into the fight, he was the name, right? He was the A side. We cannot lose track of who Charles Oliveira is, man. This dude is the real deal. And honestly, he's a difficult fight for every single one of those 4 guys that you listed that might be fighting in January. Poirier versus McGregor. And at some point, if Gaethje fights Chandler, I think Oliveira matches up great against every single one of them.
I agree. You said something earlier that I think is spot on. In my opinion, this was probably the card of the year. I have to think about it a little more, but every single fight mattered, and every single fight felt like it had a breakout performance and someone that you could really get excited about next year.